Hello, my name is Mariatta and I'm joining you all today from Vancouver, Canada. I work as staff software engineer at Uplight. In my free time, I contribute to open source projects. I'm one of the Python core developers, a PSF fellow member, and one of the co-organizers of Vancouver PyLadies. You can find me on Twitter and GitHub as Mariatta. Documentation makes or breaks an open source project. When users want to use the open source library that you made, the documentation is the first thing they'll read, not the code. Often when evaluating a third-party library, we'd look at the documentation first, and if it doesn't exist, we probably wouldn't bother looking at the code at all. Maintainers and contributors to open source projects need to care about documentation. In the Python world, documentation isn't written simply in a README. The fact that Python documentation is available on a website in HTML format with links and a search box that you can search for is what makes it useful to all of us. I really don't think I'll ever get very far in learning Python if this documentation was in a plain text README file. And we're not writing all of this with plain HTML either. Python documentation is built using a tool called Sphinx and a markup language called reStructuredtext. When talking about documentation in the Python open source community, you will hear these two terms, Sphinx and reStructuredtext. And you might wonder, what are they and how is one different from another? Let's start with reStructuredtext. reStructuredtext is a markup language. You're probably familiar with other markup languages like Markdown or HTML. The file extension is RST. This is where we write the content of the documentation. reStructuredtext is not as lightweight as Markdown. It is more complex, and it's kinda unknown outside of the Python community. Markdown has been more widely adopted. Sphinx is the documentation generator. This is the engine that converts all of your reStructuredtext files into HTML files. You would then host the HTML files generated by Sphinx. So the readers will only be reading the output HTML files and not the reStructuredtext. Now hold on, wait a minute. If reStructuredtext is more complicated than Markdown and it's kinda obscure, so why is it Python using it? Some Pythonistas I've talked to, they've never even heard of reStructuredtext because they haven't been contributing to Python open source projects before. And I've also heard people telling me that, the fact that reStructuredtext is so obscure, it is a barrier to people wanting to contribute to Python. And one of the suggestions was that we should start using Markdown for our documentation. Well, it's not that simple. The thing is, Python has been using reStructuredtext since way back in 2002, before Markdown even existed. And you can read more about this from PAP 287, which is the proposal for adopting reStructuredtext as Python docstring format. Nowadays, the core Python developers, we write pretty much everything in reStructuredtext. Python enhancements proposals, the PAPs, are all written in reStructuredtext. So if you ever want to write your own PAP one day, you have to know how to write those in reStructuredtext. And it's not just CPython that uses this. Many other Python projects like Pylint, Requests, Black AIO HTTP, Python packaging, Flask, all of their documentation are written in reStructuredtext. So if you want to contribute to any of those projects, you will need to write some documentation at some point in reStructuredtext. So this is an important and useful skill to have as an open source contributor. Markdown is not bad. It is indeed much simpler and easier to adopt, it's true. But having written documentation in both Markdown and restructured text, I just don't find Markdown sufficient. It lacks certain features. And you shouldn't feel intimidated by restructured text. Yes, it's a little complicated, but it's not hard. And you can learn this. And I want to help lower this barrier by introducing you to some of the features of restructured text and Sphinx. I'll start with the easy one. Here's a comparison of how you'd write section headers. On the left is restructured text with underlines. On the right is Markdown with the pound signs. Now, if I simply present this text to you without telling you whether they're Markdown or restructured text, or something else, like which one looks more obvious to you that they're headers? Personally, I found the underlines are to be the clearer signal that these are meant as titles. The pound sign, if I didn't know that this was a Markdown, I would think those look like code comments. Next, here's how we would write hyperlinks. In Markdown, you'd write the text you want to convert into link in square brackets, and then the URL will be in parentheses. In restructured text, it looks a little bit different. You would wrap the URL in triangular braces, and then you wrap the whole thing in backticks, and then end it with an underscore at the end. One useful feature with restructured text is that you can name and label your links, and it allows for reusability. So if you found yourself referencing the same URL multiple times in one document, you don't have to write the same URL multiple times. You can declare a name for it, and at the bottom of your docs, just type out ..space underscore and the name of the URL followed by the URL itself. And in your documentation, you can refer to it by wrapping the name of the links with backticks and an underscore after that. And you can add images by using the image directive. So it's ..space, the word image, 2 colons, and the URL to the image. Notice that there is a space between the 2 dots and the word image. So white spaces and indentation are actually important in restructured text, just like in the Python code. If you're writing technical documentation, your documentation will contain code examples. In restructured text, it's a matter of adding 2 colons, a blank space, and then your code. Your code blocks needs to be indented. Again, white space and indents are important, so you do need that extra white blank line between the 2 colons and the code block. Tables are not part of the core definition in Markdown. You would need to find an extension or a special Markdown renderer that can generate tables for you. But tables are supported natively in restructured text. Same thing as table of contents. If your documentation is long, it has lots of different headings, a table of content would be really useful to your readers. And this is so simple to do. Simply add the contents directive at the top of your documentation. So 2 dots, space, contents, and 2 colons. One of the features that I appreciate the most is the ability to do cross-referencing. Being able to provide links from one page to another page. And this is accomplished by 2 elements. First, in the document where I want to reference to, I need to declare a target. It's like a bookmark. And the syntax for this might look familiar to you. This is how we would name links. Now in another page, I can direct the readers to that specific section by adding the ref role and the name of the target. When this document is rendered in HTML, it will create a link that takes you to another page. You do not even need to hard code the file name at all. You just need to know the name of the link target. how do we get started with this whole thing? First, you'll need to install Sphinx. Pip install it, and I do recommend installing it in a virtual environment. Then in your project, your code project, you should have a dedicated directory for your documentation. And from that docs directory, type in the command Sphinx Quick Start once you have installed Sphinx. What Sphinx Quick Start does is automatically creating several files that are necessary for Sphinx to build the documentation. Once you've ran the Sphinx Quick Start command, you should see the following directories getting created: the build, the static, and the templates directories. You should also see the index.rst file automatically created for you. You can then start writing your documentation. When you're ready to build the docs and to generate the HTML out of the docs, just type make HTML in the terminal in the command line, and all the HTML will then be generated under the build HTML directory. You can then open the index file, the index HTML file with your favorite browser. Now, if you find it tedious having to rebuild the documentation each time you make changes, you can install a third-party extension called Sphinx AutoBuild. It can detect changes in your documentation as you type and automatically rebuild it and refresh the browser for you. Other useful extensions you might want to check out are the Autodoc and the InterSphinx extensions. With Autodoc, you can automatically generate documentation out of the doc strings in your codebase. With InterSphinx, you can reference other projects' documentation. reStructuredtext and Sphinx are really not that complicated. You can definitely learn this, and there are various documentation and tutorials out there, and you should check them all out. So thank you so much for listening to my talk. You can follow me on Twitter as Mariatta. If you appreciate my talks and open source contributions, one way you can support me is by becoming my sponsor on GitHub. Thank you so much.